Hello, and welcome to my talk, How Not to Tank Your Career in 280 Characters or Less, Social Media 101 from a Media Comms grad. If you attended the 2019 GCAP, this is a very condensed version of that, so probably a little less of my little attitude and the idiosyncratic ways, and a little bit more just the useful information here. Also, please forgive my recording surroundings. This is my craft room / office, which I have been sequestered in since I've had a baby. Alright, let's begin. Okay, so before we get into this, I would like to begin by acknowledging and paying my respects to the traditional owners of the lands upon which we meet and are gathered. I would like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and acknowledge any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders who might be here today. I pay my respects to your elders, past, present and emerging. Sovereignty was never ceded, always was and always will be Indigenous land. Okay, this is a talk of two parts, and that two-part talk is kind of pretty much the same as social media. This talk is about your personal as well as your professional self and how you present that in public, which of course is two sides of the same coin of social media. It's really important for you to understand that when you are presenting this professional and personal self, it is still a personal, it is just a curated personal. Don't think that they're two separate entities, they're kind of just the side that you're choosing to show to people. Okay? One thing I do want to cover as well is there is a reason why you're taught written comms as a professional skill. We are taught things like clarity. This will come up a couple of times, but when you are communicating, it is the responsibility of the communicator and what is being communicated to be clear and understood. It is not the responsibility of the person interpreting it to understand clearly. Now, of course, there are bad faith interpretations. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about clarity here. The other thing we're taught is legality, which is something else we'll cover in this talk. There are actual legal ramifications to how you behave online and how you engage with people in a written capacity. We're not talking about speaking capacity here or spoken capacity. We'll touch on it, but that's not really what we're talking about. There's also a level of ethicality. Is it ethical for you to be saying something even if it is legal and correct? This is probably something that a lot of people will misinterpret as being, what comes next, which is socio-cultural considerations. But it's also like, if it's legal for me to give out this information, should I really do it? If it's legal for me to disperse this information, is it actually good for me to do that? That sort of thing. And on that note, there's a level of socio-cultural awareness that we're kind of want you to come away with, and this is something that you need to have constantly. It's something that evolves and changes and adjusts based on the current global sphere. I know this sounds a little bit boring, especially if you can just kind of read this up online and see what you need to see, as there's a template here for you to use on how to use a business apology. But one of the big things about these templates is they're static, they don't move, and when you're coming to a malleable, very fluid social media sphere, sometimes you will hit a faux pas that you don't know about. There's also some things that these templates don't convey. One of the core things being those legal responsibilities. I'm going to actually have an example here of something that we're taught in our undergrad, which is how to write an apology letter without opening yourself up for litigation. And it's kind of really appropriate that I'm recording this now because a certain really big company just did this, right? We at Totally Responsible Company are devastated to learn that a tragedy has occurred at our worksite. We endeavour to maintain a safe working environment for all staff, and to know that our procedures may have been ignored is unacceptable to us. We are in contact with the family and those involved to uncover what has led to this event in an effort to ensure it never happens again. Now, you also notice, and you've probably read things like this before, that there are never the words "I'm" and "sorry" or "we are sorry" in here. The reason that's not in there is because the moment a company says those words and admits fault, they open themselves up to litigation. And so, while it's kind of shit that some companies don't say that, there is a legal reason to not do it. Instead, they fill it with pathos, egos, and logos. So you have your emotional, things are terrible, and something terrible happened, and of course we feel terribly. You have your, plea to the audience. What more could be done? We did everything that we could do. It's not our fault. We have safety procedures, and the blame that must therefore fall on someone else, which is basically, you can't sue us, it's not our fault. And then we have an internal investigation, so if it happens again, it still won't be our fault. This kind of might seem a little bit heavy-handed, but there are examples of how this has hit people in the industry and in the world. A good example of this is the Oxford comma, which is something I harp on about all the time. It's actually the Harvard comma, but we're going to pretend that that doesn't exist, and this is the Oxford comma, okay? There's a lot of really fun examples out there. This is a really good one that appeared in, numerous places. The last one is my favorite, that says that Peter Ustinov's global tour includes encounters with Nelson Mandela, comma, an 800-year demigod, no Oxford comma, and a dildo collector, which means that Nelson Mandela is all of those things, which we laugh about, but importantly, there are repercussions for that. So, this is a news article that came out in about 2017, where in the state of Maine there was a clause that said that in a company had a clause that said that anything that was processed in such a way in this company was not liable for overtime. So what's happening is they should have an Oxford comma after that packaging for shipment comma. Without that, it means that everything in this list, if it's not being packaged for shipment or distribution, becomes liable for overtime. So if you're just packaging it to put it somewhere else in the building. And now this kind of seems really, heavy-handed, but it resulted in a $13 million lawsuit, and I think they settled for $10 million. I might be incorrect in that, but it is an example of how Oxford commas and legal writing actually has a fiscal consequence to it. The legal consequences for these sort of things is not easily determined. We can say really easily that it is slander, libel, or defamation, and you can Google what those mean. But these are things that are argued by people who spend a long time studying, and they argue that in a court of law, which we'll talk about soon. But what I'm trying to do here today is, instead of making you go study all this, I'm just going to give you something to think about, so the words that you say online don't come around to screw your life up. The reason why people study and do the things that I do results in things that you've probably seen, like the words accused and allegedly and charged with. The reason these pop up is because they are safe words to use, in print specifically. This is even though it might be super duper obvious, even in some cases where someone is found guilty, you might still see these words accused, allegedly, and charged with. Because essentially these words exist, or they are used in a sense that stops publications from being sued. For example, if someone says that the man who murdered his business partner, and then in a court of law he's found innocent, that line is not only false, it is defamation. So it is now something that allows that newspaper or that headline publication to be sued. So they use these because it is the truth. They are accused, they are alleged, they are charged. Even after they're found guilty, they'll still probably use these words for those reasons. This does come back, this safe use of words does sometimes come back and bite us all in the butt a little bit. And it is stuff that gets studied. There's a really good example by Jane Gilmore called Fixed It, where she goes through and she tackles really misogynistic or harmful headlines that, further damage marginalized communities or marginalized cultures of people, and ingrain harmful stereotypes. So I recommend you read that if you can. But for now, and in lieu of taking all that time to read that and doing an undergrad, what you normally do for covers and press releases is you hire a professional, even internal documentation if you've got a big enough company. You hire a professional, and in fact the more important something is, the more qualified the professional you should get is. This is why you hire lawyers for things like contracts, and why you hire accountants to handle your money, because that's literally their job. These are people it is literally their job to communicate legal terms in a way that is not going to get you sued. which might sound really obvious, but I still go online and I still see people say terrible things. In fact, I think we've had a slew of them that are about to roll through or have rolled through the courts, where people have said things that they shouldn't have said, and it is now, in legal capacity at least, coming to haunt them. Of course, you are not potentially a multi-billion-dollar owner of a company, or you might not be the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar company, or you might not be some very prominent people having a very terrible time in the media, but this is still relevant to you. Everything you put out there is accessible. Everything you put out in the public sphere, if you can access it, someone else can access it. So even the secure stuff can be accessed by people who just maybe have your way in or another way in. We do have the benefit that a lot of the companies that we rely on and their security, it is in their best interest to not be hacked, but that doesn't mean that it can't happen. So there is this understanding that anything you put out there isn't really 100% secure, so you need to be careful about what you put out there, even if you are deleting it or getting rid of it. 10-year-old stuff can come back and haunt you. I don't agree with it, but that's not what we're talking about here, right? And this might seem a little bit like I'm, yelling at you when you already know, but this is just kind of me telling you that there's stuff that you should think about and how to think about it before it comes back to bite you in the ass. One thing a lot of people don't realize is that they are their own PR, their own public relations. Your Facebook, your Twitter, Snapchat, Instagram, everything you put out there is something that demonstrates a part of you. I said at the start of this talk that your professional side is still just your personal side. It's just curated, right? It's the stuff that you don't want to show certain people for certain reasons. Whether or not you agree with why is irrelevant. It is still a curated side of you. So, what you put into the world, you have to choose, and how you put it into the world. And there's a lot of social media out there, right? If you can have a headline in 2021 that says 101 social media networking sites that you need to know about, it means there's more. Don't ask me what they are. I just know the standards like Twitter and Instagram and Facebook, which I don't use. Now, a few people in hearing this might come up with the phrase that you should be able to say what you want. You should be able to put it out there, or, you are entitled to your opinion. I want to deconstruct this a little bit, and in deconstructing it, I want to talk about the actual ramifications of thinking like this. So, people have opinions. That's a given, right? We have opinions. The thing with opinions, though, is they live inside your brain. And this idea that you're entitled to your opinion, the word entitled means you are given special treatment or consideration. The word entitled doesn't necessarily apply to people taking your opinion. It's the fact that your opinion lives in your brain and therefore no one can take it. The problem is a lot of people still think that their opinion exists outside their brain with the same sort of privileges. When you take an opinion and you broadcast it to the world, say on Twitter, it's no longer living inside your brain, and the act of broadcasting it is an action. And this is what people take issue with. It is not the fact that you feel or think this, right? We're not persecuting thought crime, which is a good thing. It's the idea that when you've taken it from your brain and put it into the world in an action, this action is what people take issue with. It is not the opinion, it is the putting it out there of thisness that they are upset about. So, one thing I do want to cover is that this is not a clean thing. This is not a clean distinction. This is not a clean yes or no, right or wrong situation. This is a place or a thing that gets argued in the courts of law quite vehemently. We just had a very messy case when that was way too public about defamation and slander and libel and all that wonderful abusive jazz. I'm not going to go into it, but you know what I'm talking about. And that case went for 6 weeks, and this is how long these cases can go for. So this is not me saying, here, this is what slander and libel and defamation are. This is me saying, these are things that could bite you later. Please proceed with caution. Here there be dragons. So, On that note, as with entitled to opinion, I'm sure there are some people who are thinking this and this idea of freedom of speech. Freedom of speech is ethereal. It is a concept that humans have come up with and defend to various states and interpret to various states. Freedom of speech covers very specifically the creation of laws that infringe upon a civilian's right to say stuff. So freedom of speech involves the government not creating laws that say you can't say the word cabbage, for example. It says, freedom of speech says you can't stop people from saying the word cabbage. It's not a bad word, right? There are things that are not included in freedom of speech. Freedom of speech doesn't prevent you from being sued. That's not you being sued for the use of the word cabbage. It's you being sued for the action of uttering cabbage in a way, right? You stand outside someone's house at 2 o'clock in the morning shouting cabbage through a megaphone. They're not suing you for the word anymore. You know what I mean? It doesn't prevent you from being fired, banned, or removed from anything. And it doesn't stop you from being deplatformed, especially by a private entity. It doesn't matter how popular or well used or widespread that private entity is. If it is a private entity, it is covered by freedom of speech. Freedom of speech concerns the government and the government's lawmaking. It doesn't concern you being told off for something you shouldn't have done or something that has upset somebody. That's all it is. Really importantly as well, if a private company decides to sever ties with someone who says something they don't agree with, that's actually freedom of speech. Freedom of speech means you cannot be compelled to say something you don't want to say as well. Again, the government cannot compel you to say it. Now, as I mentioned, this is all very, ethereal. This is something that gets argued a lot in the court of law. But what isn't argued is it does have limits. Things aren't necessarily automatically protected by freedom of speech. Hate speech, as it is defined by anyone who is defining it, anything that incites to illegal action, harmful conduct, and stuff that's counterproductive to a functioning society. Essentially, the you can't yell fire in a crowded theatre kind of thing. No one is stopping you from using the word fire, but if you decide to shout it in a place where there are repercussions, those repercussions can result in court action, right? And the reason I'm bringing this up is pretty much, please stop using it wrong. Please stop using it wrong. This is not, you can use freedom of speech, but just stop using it wrong. And people are allowed to just get mad at what other people say. It's okay. Okay? Please. Okay, so moving on, sort of. I want to reiterate that we are not talking about, in terms of freedom of speech or communication, we're not talking about governance or companies. I'm talking about you as an individual. And the way that these things work is if someone decides they are upset with what you're saying, they enact a lawsuit against an individual, right? What they're having a lawsuit against, or the thing that might bite you in the ass, or the thing that might get you fired, or the thing that might get you disciplined at work or not hired, is that you've done a thing, right? You have done a thing which has resulted in something, right? This is where those words start popping up: slander, discrimination, harassment, libel, defamation, verbal assault. They're all things, right? It's that standing outside someone else's house, shouting cabbage through a megaphone at 3 o'clock in the morning. The issue is not the word cabbage, okay? I don't know why I'm picking on cabbages today. I want to quickly define these words because I've been using them a lot. Defamation is an umbrella term. Defamation, which you can look up if you want to, but defamation specifically involves the act of harming someone by saying or writing something that is proven to be false, okay? Slander and libel are both defamation, but they aren't the same as each other, okay? Yeah, they're slander and libel are defamation, but they're not the same. Slander is intangible, spoken, and out loud, verbal. Libel is tangible, written, and published. So those are the distinctions between the two. The core issue is that they have brought harm to somebody. They have harmed them in some way, usually financially, through either loss of opportunity or loss of reputation. They also have to be false. Okay? And now this is something that is very interesting because the courts of law allow us to argue for things that are false or true, but they just don't have enough evidence. And this is why I keep reiterating this stuff is really ethereal. It is not set in stone. I cannot point to something and say this is or is not libel. What I can say is you can take them to court over it, because it's up to whether or not there's enough evidence for it to be libel, provably false with harm. It can be false, but if there's no harm done, usually financial harm, if you can't prove there's financial harm done, then it kind of goes nowhere. But that's why we pay people who study for a really long time and know a lot of stuff about laws. And I'm really sorry to this stock guy who I searched stock lawyer image, and he's a lawyer now, right? When you do put it out there, though, there are some consequences that aren't necessarily as severe as law, but can be as serious, because once you stick stuff in the world, people will critique you. They will. It's going to happen. And in fact, you are going to critique them. And going back on that idea of you being your own PR, your social media is kind of the job interview you don't know you're having. And you can check who you are, because that is what your boss is going to do. When they're going to hire you, when they're going to make sure that you are someone they can bring on board, your social media footprint is going to be scoured. Scoured, and it should be. And of course there's stuff out there that will help you moderate your online reputation. But before we do that, I just want to leave you with a consideration checklist. Right? These should be things that'll help you. Who do you represent? You or a company? And if you represent that company, or if you want to represent a company, will they care about what you're saying now? Who is going to look at it? What are the implications? How do you make sure you are really clear about your intent? I released a tweet recently that said that you cannot have nuanced conversation in 280 characters or less. You can't. You cannot. Right? Are you really the one who should be saying it? And is it important that it's said by you? Okay? It can be said by someone else. You really need to think of now and of the future, and you really need to think about these ones. Is it actually important for you to be the one saying it? Because when someone's got this many responses on their tweet, no one sees it except the people who are looking directly at you. So make sure it is important that it is said by you. As I said, the onus of declarative communication, as well as intent, is on the communicator, not the recipient. And now, if you decide that it is still worth it, and this is the go for it, the I'm going to do it checklist, it might be important that you voice your support or condemnation. It might be important that you have some expertise and advice to share. It might be something positive that you can provide to the situation. I cannot tell you what those are. You have to make that decision. I could teach you, sort of, because, I clearly don't care. I clearly don't care what people think of me, or at the very least, my professional curated self is very specific. I'm very ranty, and people know this. My boss follows me on Twitter. I don't care. But even then, I am very careful about what I put out there. The I'm going to do it checklist: avoid your absolutes, avoid targeted critique, avoid discussing minorities you are not a part of. By avoid, I mean don't do it. Avoid enlightened information. I say avoid hot takes. I don't, but I will tell you, do as I say and not as I do. Use very wisely, I think, and I believe, generalized commentary, and no blame, promote growth. Don't say it's just my opinion. We know it is. Your word choice is very important. Make sure you use your words carefully. Too long didn't read. As we close up, never tweet in anger. Act, do not react. If you could not show your boss, don't do it. If you feel you have to hide your identity to say it, don't do it. Safety considerations aside, of course. And finally, I will leave you with this one question. If this tweet gets me fired now, in 10 years, or in 20 years, am I okay with that? Because if the answer is no, then it's not worth it. And if the answer is yes, then go for it. Good luck out there. Thanks.